In the winter of 1971, Keith Blissum worked as a bouncer at a place which was called the Chicken Ranch. You might know it from a movie which was made of it that featured Burt Reynolds called The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. Honestly, that was the title of the movie. The actual name of that particular establishment was the Chicken Ranch. Before becoming a nationwide celebrity, the ranch was no different from the other houses in the area. Of course, by the time Keith worked for the ranch, the tradition of trading chickens for the things the ranch was known had long gone the way of the dodo and the dinosaur. When Keith worked there, it was cash up front. For the most part anyway. As you might have seen in the movie, the sheriff didn't have such obstacles. Anyway, it was just another Saturday night when the thing was spotted in the parking lot of the ranch. Naturally, when one of the clients came in claiming there was an 8-foot-tall hairy beast walking through the parking lot, it got everybody's attention. Understand that this was Texas. Everybody had a gun. However, they were not allowed to bring them inside, so when the announcement came that there was an 8-foot gorilla in the parking lot, it drew the attention of nearly every man who had a gun in his glove compartment to come out of their rooms and head for their cars. Keith went out ahead of the other men, not having to stop and put his clothes on and find his shoes and socks. He was actually able to catch a glimpse of the big creature, and sure enough, it was there. The man had not been lying. Now, what would you have done in that situation? Let us know in the comments. Keith didn't go out armed into the parking lot, though there were firearms available inside the ranch. He didn't really expect to see anything when he stepped outside. At most, he expected there would be a guy doing something drunkenly stupid. There was a slight chance he might have a gorilla mask he was wearing. Keith did not encounter any of those things. What he was seeing was real. It had to be. It was too big to be anything else. While his eyes took in the details of the beast, his nose was attacked by a foul odor which surely was coming from the beast. It had long, flowing hair all over its body except around the face. He couldn't see the front of the animal, but it appeared like it either had short or no hair on its face. The angle of sight did not allow him to see its face better. The width of the thing's shoulders was impressive. It had huge meaty arms that hung down to nearly its shins. Keith couldn't help thinking about how all the feminists who had claimed that the unevolved men were knuckle-draggers may not have been all that far off. It didn't run or even seem to rush to leave the area, but at the same time it did not shuffle its feet. As he was seeing the beast leave the parking lot, the men who were there as clients came pouring out, headed to their respective cars to get their guns. The last thing Keith saw was the beast's head as it disappeared into the night while chaos ensued in the parking lot. In those days, the only thing more appealing to the men of Texas than a visit to the local chicken ranch was to go on a legal manhunt chasing a target that was 8 feet tall, and it was yet to be determined whether it was man or animal. Keith had an idea it wouldn't matter too much to the men who were organizing to go after the beast. It was headed for the Colorado River. Or at least in that direction. Keith figured that was where it was going because he had heard about the Boggy Creek incident, so it stood to reason this creature was headed for where the water was at. He went back into the ranch and was given permission to take their gun and join in the hunt for the creature. His boss said there wasn't going to be any money made until the boys got this itch scratched, so he might as well go along and maybe he'd be the one to end all the excitement. Thus Keith was given the sawed-off double barrel from under the bar, and he ran out of the ranch trying to catch up with the posse that had just had a guy with some dogs show up. The hunt was on. There was about a dozen men and 3 dogs that left that parking lot in chase of the hairy beast that had made the mistake of wandering through the wrong busy parking lot. There was no snow on the ground, but that wasn't all that uncommon. However, there had been some moisture in the recent past, so the men looked for tracks and were not disappointed. They were not long-lived, however, as the men and dogs also left prints which quickly covered up the prints that had initially been found, despite everyone's best effort to avoid destroying them. The 2 men who were holding the 3 dogs were ordered to get them away from the prints, so they were taken further down the trail and more prints were discovered, causing the men to stop worrying about the prints they were worried about saving, and then everybody went to see the second prints found. This actually went on for 2 more times before the tracks were lost. The men spread out and searched for where the tracks again picked up, but after about 45 minutes they were at a loss. The dogs acted weird. It was anybody's guess why they weren't picking up on a scent which was so strong Keith thought he might be able to follow it without the use of the dogs. Okay, to be fair, the odor was faint but very offensive, which Keith thought was probably from the Bigfoot. Others agreed. The dogs, which a couple of the men vouched for, didn't seem to have any interest in going the direction the men thought the creature probably went. Further discussion was held and it was decided the beast was probably headed for the Colorado, since that was the direction it had been going for the short distance they were able to track it. Plus, it made sense. These beasts were known to like swamps. The men continued to follow the direction they thought the creature was headed. What really surprised the men was when the dogs started not just showing no interest in going the direction the men thought the creature had went, but they eventually began showing a lot of interest in not going any further in the direction they had been headed. First the lead dog stopped and then the two behind it began to turn around, and finally they were actually whimpering to be allowed to go away from the direction the group had been going. It was dark and it didn't take long before some of the men were of the same mind as the dogs. They pointed out that out here in the darkness it wouldn't take much for the tables to get turned and they would end up being the hunted instead of the hunters. A couple of the men started talking about how when they got to thinking about it, if they hurried they might be able to get back in with the woman they'd left. There was so general male chatter, locker room stuff, and while in the midst of all that there came a roar through the night that was extremely guttural and unlike anything Keith had ever heard before. Suddenly the dogs were whimpering worse than ever. Then the group heard something crashing through the brush which nearly sent the group running in fear, but one of the men hollered to hold it. The last thing they wanted to do was to get split up and go racing into the night where if anything happened they might end up shooting each other. There were 10 guns and 10 men. All they had to do was to hold their positions. Each man pick out another to keep an eye on, and they would back out of there, and in 20 minutes they'd be back in bed with their honey, drinking some good whiskey and telling some bad lies about what heroes they all had been. There was the sound of some limbs breaking. It sounded like big limbs. The dogs were now pulling at their leashes to go back the way they had come. The men followed their lead and they used that suggestion of keeping an eye on one person. Keith got the job of being the last one in the line because he had the scatter gun which would do the most damage up close. He was the only one who didn't have to keep an eye on somebody else. He was free to keep turning around and watching their six while using that double barrel for protection. Which he was consistent about doing. Hard to blame him. The darkness was full of noises which could be something moving on them. The only thing the darkness did not have was the noise from insects. It had reached temperatures to send the insects wherever it was they went when things got cold. What had started out as a bunch of good old boys who were more than likely all 3 sheets to the wind before taking off on this crusade, turned into something very different. The men started out lit and then had continued to grab a few swigs of courage while the discussion went on in the parking lot. After a couple brave speeches slurred at the little mob of like-minded good-intended citizens, it was decided they should go after the beast. To which they loudly and drunkenly pursued the big hairy beast. It likely doesn't know drunk from blind, but it as likely does know a gun when it sees one and what they are capable of doing. So when the citizens of Fayette County, Texas go on a Bigfoot hunt armed to the teeth in the dark of the night, it isn't going to understand these men couldn't currently hit water if they fell out of a boat. It just knows it is being hunted. It might have been just another wild, fun thing to do on a boring Saturday night in Grange to the men who were laughing their way down the trail after the big creature, but the creature might not have seen it in such a jovial manner. Or maybe it did know they were all too far in the bottle to be any real threat. It was hard to say whether it meant to actually hurt anybody or if it was just returning the favor of letting the men know what it feels like to be hunted. The men reached a point where they became unclear as to whether they were the hunters or now being hunted. Perhaps they had let their imaginations get the better of them. That they were just jumping at shadows. Then they would hear another big limb break and the dogs would pick up their whimpering. Next the noises seemed to be coming from a direction parallel to the men. Then they would hear it on the opposite side of their position. Soon the men were not talking at all. Any fun and games about this had evaporated like mist sprayed on a hot sidewalk. The dogs seemed to understand and were also being quiet as to listen into the darkness surrounding them. Flashlights beamed this way and that as the men searched the darkness for any sign of something coming at them. Suddenly one of the men let out a yelp and it came to be known he had been struck by a rock of about the size of a softball, though more flat than round. It drew blood and the guy was hurt pretty good. The group continued to back out the way they came while listening for any further sounds of something out there stalking them. It sounded like it was all around them. First it would be on one side, then on the other. How was it getting back and forth so quickly? They would hear it moving, but there would just be the slightest hint that it was changing position. The dogs were no help. They had stopped moving their heads in the direction of where they thought the creature was at and now were just trying to hide their faces in the legs of the men holding their leashes. It got to the point where the man in the lead had to take lead and dragged the dog along with him. It was clear the dogs neither wanted to go forward, but they were also terrified staying in the one spot. They continued to whimper and try and hide themselves in the legs of the men. Finally one of the men bent down and picked up the dog and said to hell with it, and he carried the dog down the path back towards the ranch. Finally, after what seemed like forever, they reached a point where the dogs seemed to have relaxed. The dog being carried was put down and it seemed content with that action. This put the entire group of 10 at ease. While they stopped for a quick rest, there was further attention paid to the man who had been hit by the rock. It was decided that he was lucky. The rock had been thrown so it would hit with its broadside. Had it been thrown like a frisbee or a throwing star, the results might have been much worse, possibly even fatal. Conversation returned and flasks made another appearance. It was apparent to all that the danger was past. They made their way back to the parking lot where they filled out reports to the sheriff and his deputy. Both cars were there. They had the whole force out. Just kidding about it being the whole force. That was the night Bigfoot came to La Grange. Back when they got a lot of nice girls out there. Much respect to Z-Stop. Cheers. Thanks for visiting. Please subscribe. Godspeed all.